Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is March 30th, 2022. Tonight is the second part of a series of a review of the book Context by J.D. Gill. If you've listened to this podcast with any kind of regularity, you might know that Jamie or JD is my therapist, the one I've been seeing for the last 23 years. She has somewhere around the neighborhood of 25 books and still going strong. And this particular book, I think, has some, especially part two, has some wonderful application to parenting, to parenting children who are struggling with addictions and mental health issues. So I'm really excited to get to the second part. I will tell you, for those of you that are watching live or watching the video recording of this, that there's a lot of text this evening. It's a text heavy. So as I do, I'm going to go through the chapters that I've the second half of the book, and I'm going to read some of Jamie's quotes, and then I'm going to expand on those and talk about how they fit into attachment-based therapy, the kind of work that we do at Evoke Therapy Program, the kind of work that I teach. So the first chapter is about polarity, and I think we've seen a real upsurge, I guess, in the polarity in our country. Right, there is a lot of us versus them, and binaries in our world, whether it's gender or race or financial inequality or political party, and anything. Even the most recent news events seem to really drive a wedge in between the two-party system, if you will. I'm not talking about political, but the two-party system, the two sensibilities that we often engage. And so she talks about polarity, and I'll talk about that. She says, polarity has shown us who we are. And I think in a way, the pandemic has, like I said, amplified that polarity. To have someone acknowledge that we matter, to be important instead of another face in the crowd, to be admired is a primary need for a human being, right? We want to feel special. And when we don't have that experience in childhood of being seen, of being special, as Jamie often says, of being the bee's knees to our parents, oftentimes that hole that is left by that unmet need is something that we end up striving for much of our lives. Although I'm not completely over and haven't healed that part of myself, I can tell you in a profound way, I spent the first 45 years of my life trying to prove to the world that I was special, trying to prove to the world that I had something important to offer, that I mattered, that paying attention to me would bring greater, they'd bring something to the world, that I had value. So we start off with that idea. Jamie writes, the child must learn whether the family is rich or poor, autocratic or nurturing, religious or not, and how educated or not, or sports-minded or not we are. The point is that small children learn kind of where they stand in the binary, right? The black or the white, the hot or the cold. And because looking at the world in a binary is a primitive way of coping, that's an important thing to understand. When we are under stress, we reduce the world oftentimes into good and bad, good and evil, right and wrong. We have a hard time walking the middle path, holding two truths. I saw some posts with the most recent pop culture event that happened on Sunday with the Academy Awards. I saw some posts fairly early on in the process talking about this idea that two competing things can be true at the same time. And in a sense, a lot of times when we do therapy, we're trying to help people embrace the dialectics, right? The two seemingly opposite ideas that can be held at the same time. And not to be too reductive about it myself, but one way of thinking about mental health is how well we live in the gray, how well we live and look at life on a continuum instead of the two piles of right and wrong, good and bad. And that's what she starts to identify. She says extreme views require splitting of the mind in much the same way that gender does. That is, there is no place for middle ground. Things are either black or white. This kind of polarized thinking creates an artificial split in a concept of reality where there is a gradient between poles, not two discrete points. I remember some time ago, I was doing a podcast with my friend and colleague, Molly Carmel, who runs a wonderful podcast and runs a wonderful practice helping people with disordered eating. And we were talking about some aspect of the work, and I mentioned, I said, it's kind of like that, the middle path. And she said, as she has the ability to do, isn't everything, Brad, about the middle path? Isn't everything about learning to embrace the gradient, as Jamie describes it? And I think part of our stories, part of the myths, part of the movies that we watch and the stories that we read are trying to teach us this. Most good stories will show you that the hero is not all good and the villain is not all bad. In essence, what these stories are trying to teach us is to embrace all of us, all of humanity. Not to accept any behavior, not to have no boundaries, not that, but at least from a spiritual perspective, to be able to transcend that kind of early childhood splitting that goes on when we reduce things into two piles of good and bad, male and female, so forth and so on. Jamie goes on to say, black and white thinking is a characteristic of borderline levels of personality organization. I talk about this. In fact, I have a podcast that Malia can post for your viewing later on. The podcast is called Borderline Thinking. It is thought borderline people are the products of backgrounds that were very chaotic. There was no consistency, which will allow for the development of a sense that things and people can be both good and bad. Development stopped just short of this at the position things and people are good or bad. Black and white thinking may thus be thought of as a lens through which we see reality. Our side is good, your side is bad. Anything that favors our side is good, anything that favors your side is bad. So, that idea that we get invited into in our culture, in the dominant culture, the idea that we're inclined to want to look for a simple label for a behavior or a person or an idea comes from a developmental delay, comes from a young child's way of processing. And if if there's a lot of chaos, like Jamie's saying, if there's a lot of trauma, like Dr. Gill is describing, oftentimes children become arrested at that level of thinking. And it's important to say, I love to make this point because it gives us, again, perspective about the continuum. Under stress, if any of us were put under stress, we would devolve. Almost everybody would devolve into this kind of borderline thinking, this black and white thinking. So it's a stress response. It's a trauma response. It's a way of taking a complicated, overwhelming world, chaotic world, as she describes, and making it simple the way that a child would think about it. So that's an important thing to understand. Malia, you're sharing that with me. I think you want to share that with the public. Speaking about safety, she goes on to talk about safety. She says, perhaps primary among the needs of living organisms is safety. Without it, life is impossible. Other creatures, of course, excuse me, just got to go back to that. Other creatures will kill and eat you. Human beings are born helpless and require adequate caregiving in order to survive. Thus, at the very beginning, human beings require relationship. They will go on in requiring relationships all of their lives in order to survive, learn, work, love, and procreate. So because we are actually uniquely helpless as children, and actually, if you just threw one of us out into the wild to fight the bears and the lions and the tigers and the alligators, the snakes, we would be a fairly pathetic creature on our own. And so what makes us resilient as a species, what makes us capable of accomplishing what we've accomplished in the world historically and day to day, is relationship, is that we can communicate and bond and work together. Anything that I write, for example, in fact, think about the infinite number, virtually infinite number of things that make this exchange with you possible. The amount of people whose shoulders I stand on to be able to provide a live video broadcast with slides into your home or to your phone, wherever you sit across the world. And later on, the podcast is a similar kind of technology. We need relationships. Relationships are fundamental to our species. It's what helps us to survive and thrive at almost every level. The particular quality, Jamie goes on to write, of this attachment serves as a basis for all subsequent relationships the child will develop. Thus, a healthy mother-child or parent-child attachment leads to the likelihood of healthy future relationships with others, whereas a poor attachment leads to the likelihood of future emotional struggles. I talk about this a lot. The quality of the initial relationship of caregiver and child becomes a pattern. And when there is pathology, when there is anxiety, when there's a disconnect, when there's abandonment or abuse or a lack of responsiveness to the child's needs, the child begins to form an idea about themselves. We human beings make sense of ourselves in the context of that early relationship. We see ourselves as good or bad, broken, needy, helpful, a delight, wonderful, beautiful, fantastic. We see ourselves not because of the words that are offered to us. That's a fraction of the impact, but by how the parent, the primary caregiver, responds to us, feels about us, treats us, reacts to us. And then that relationship then becomes something we seek after. Right? We look at that relationship unconsciously, and we look for other relationships that unconsciously remind us of the way that we were treated from our early relationship. So if the relationship is on the healthier end of the continuum, we seek after more healthy relationships. If it's on the more pathological end of the continuum, we seek after those. And this is a kind of a take-home point. Jamie writes, the majority of attachment problems do not come from abuse and neglect, but from parental ignorance about what psychology and development, as well as untreated psychological problems in the caregiver. So part of it is about ignorance, not knowing, but part of it is also about unhealed issues in the caregiver. It took me most of my career so far to figure out that intelligence, learning about, if you're listening to these podcasts, if you're reading my books of other self-help authors, other child and parenting and relationship experts, couples experts, and so forth, if you're reading those thinking that if I understand the psychology of it, I'll essentially fix the problem, that's only just a part of it. That can help, that can aid, that can assist. But again, it's also related to the relationships that existed in our early experiences, our early attachment experiences, and how they impacted us, how they shaped us. We form, if you will, to be a certain kind of shape, like a puzzle piece. Right? If you had mother and father X and Y, parent X and Y, the way that they treated you, the way that they responded to you shapes you to a certain puzzle piece shape. And then we go out in the world looking for where we fit, looking for people who, again, none of this is conscious. In fact, most of us at a conscious level, we try to avoid marrying our parents. We find people that, at least on the surface, to the conscious mind, look different than our mothers, look different than our fathers. But there are patterns and processes that are more deep and subtle and nuanced that we gravitate towards. I shared this quote today on my social media from Carl Jung. And it said, parents should always be conscious of the fact that they themselves are the principal cause of neuroses in their children. The statement was a little bit heavy-handed, I thought. But what Dr. Jung is saying is, look at the impact. There's always a given and a made, right? There's always a brain and a nervous system that a child comes with. That once birth occurs, we have no control over that. Doesn't matter if they're adopted or born into a traditional, old-fashioned mother and father family. Doesn't matter. So that's the given. And then the made is how we interact with that creature. They could have attention deficit. How we interact with our attention deficit child will impact them. They could have a nervous system that's difficult to soothe. That's a given. How we interact with the child that's difficult to soothe will have an impact on them. And that's why I think developmental processes, developmental and attachment is something that's underreported or under talked about in the at least the pop culture literature on how we turn out the way that we do. In other words, it's not the big event, or it's not whether or not you have ADHD, a learning difference, or you're born without a limb. It's not those things that have the major impact. The more transcendent and impactful is how the parent or caregivers respond to who the child is. So yes, part of it is about tools and education. That's part of why you come. But part of it is about learning to be a different kind of person. Learning to unpack and unravel your own trauma, to get clear about the gifts, the blessings, and the wounds from your own childhood. To see how your childhood was different from other childhoods. The more you do work in those areas, get clear in those areas, the more capable you are responding to the unique child that you have before you and their specific needs. Going on, Jamie writes, Winnicott used the term false self to describe as a defensive organization necessary in the infant or child as the result of inadequate mothering or failures in empathy. The false self is an appearance the child adopts to, one, please the parent, and two, to hide or disguise the real self. Stern outlined parental responses that contribute to the formation of the false self in the child. These are non-attunement, not being able to respond and see and sense the child's needs. Misattunements, kind of a mismatch. You might have a child that thinks and behaves very differently than you, adopted or not. And selective attunements. I like the things, I only engage with my child on the things that matter to me. Each of these factors, she explains, result in a mismatch between parent and child. Selective responses can be traced to the parent's conscious and unconscious fears, desires, and fantasies. Such selective responses are attempts to shape the child in the direction that the parent wants. It's really important to understand what it means to help the child get to where they need to go while still maintaining our own value system, our own boundaries, our own sense of self. And that's in contrast to trying to shape the child in the way that I think that they should go, that I know their truth and I know their path. And not a coincidence that most often people who think about it as shaping a child into the way that the parent wants, the path for the child looks a lot like the path of the parents. To follow my life, to go and follow my fears, my journey, my sadness, my happiness. Jamie writes, nobody has a perfect childhood or a perfect parent-child bond. If we did, it would be really tough to leave home. The range of difficult childhood types is broad, from disastrous to disappointing, from physically or verbally abusive to narcissistic or emotionally unpredictable ones, to parents who rarely, never really saw who their child was. No matter what the suffering, all healing involves grief work. How we were treated as children informs so much of how we feel about ourselves. That's what I've been explaining. Were we treated with respect and kindness, or were we shamed and punished or yelled at? Was love conditional on performance, getting good grades, being a good girl or boy, being athletic, good looking, or acting a certain way? Was love withdrawn if we didn't behave? Did we have parents whose own emotional needs were so large that they overshadow our own? So much of our childhood involved taking care of our parents instead of them taking care of us. I know I say this about a lot of things, but if there was one idea that I wish that all of us parents could wake up to without the barrier of shame and guilt, it would be to be aware of how much we first as children were asked to take care of our parents' feelings and sense of self and serenity. And then conversely, be able to see how we inadvertently ask that of our children. I said this on the broadcast last week when I was talking about part one. My adult daughter, 27-year-old daughter, and I were talking about this idea of children taking care of parents. And I came into parenting knowing about that. But I had such a simplistic view of it, I couldn't see it for many, many years. Many, many years. How I asked my children to take care of me. And I can see it now, and I stumble over it, and I struggle with it, and I'm a work in progress in this area. But just acknowledging it, just knowing that it's happening, frees everybody in the family up just a little bit more to be who they are, especially the children. Jamie goes on to write, the results of such childhoods appear as holes when one is stuck in a bad relationship, in anger, sadness, anxiety, or feeling like a victim. Berman feels the first step in repairing parent holes is to, quote, embrace a radical empathy for yourself. Thus, rather than blaming or ridiculing oneself for one's bad choices, feelings, and mistake, one empathizes with one's lost self. That is, one treats oneself as a caring parent would. She doesn't say this in this particular part of the book. She says it in other places many times. But to practice this radical empathy, I wrote this last night just before I was falling asleep. I think we have to have contact with somebody who shows us that empathy. It could be a therapist, a friend, a mentor, a spouse. It could even be an author that we don't meet. Or it could be even believing and having faith in a God, understanding a God who has this kind of compassion and grace for us. But we need to have some contact with empathy to be able to practice self-empathy. Some parents, she writes, however, act out. I love that phrase. Some parents, however, act out when confronted by adult children. They may deny the child's reality or become defensively aggressive. It may be the adult's best course of action in such cases is to move beyond such parents as well as the parent's definition of the child adult. I wish I could tell you that having been trained and educated in this, that I can always listen to my children when I have the energy perfectly. And I can't. I have been set up in ways where all the variables were ideal. And I've failed in this process because, first of all, I'm threatened by it, threatened by their anger and their sadness and their hurt and their disappointment of me. And when that happens, my prefrontal cortex goes offline, the part of my brain that thinks through things, and I'm operating from the fight or flight part of my brain, and then I lose all sense of reality and rationality. It's really difficult to not pay attention to the description of our children's view of us, of their childhood, without wanting to correct it, without pointing out the inconsistencies in their stories, without giving counterexamples. It's really, really, really difficult to do that. And so we learn, what I teach is we learn to listen to our children as if they're telling us a story like a dream. On the surface, our dreams are crazy. Flying buses and little pigs that talk to us, right? Our dreams are crazy, crazy imagery. But beneath that imagery, beneath the surface of that imagery, is always a truth that is being spoken from our unconscious to us about the dilemmas that we are working through today. And so if we can learn to listen to our children like we would to our own dreams, we get past the surface or superficial level interpretation. We listen to the hurt, to the fear, to the sadness, to the loneliness, to the anger. We even listen to their accusations of our inability to listen to them as an underlying theme of not really being heard. I thought about this quote. I posted this quote borrowed from Tim Ferriss yesterday. Tim Ferriss shared this quote from somebody else. Looks like the author's name is Anthony DeMello. Tim quotes and says, anytime you're practicing renunciation, you're deluded. How about that? You're deluded. What are you renouncing? Anytime you renounce something, you are tied forever to the thing that you are trying to renounce. There's a guru in India who says, every time a prostitute comes to me, she's talking about nothing but God. She says, I'm sick of my life and the way that I'm living. I want God. But every time a priest comes to me, he's talking about nothing except for sex. Very well, when you renounce something, you're stuck in it forever. When you fight something, you're tied to it forever. As long as you're fighting it, you are giving it power. You give it as much power as you are using to fight it. You give it as much power as it takes to fight it. So the big shift in this work, in attachment-based work, in what we understand about childhood development, about the development of human beings, is we learn, instead of fighting and ridiculing ourselves, we learn to embrace and understand ourselves with compassion. And the great paradox or irony of doing the work is, the more compassion that you develop for yourself, the more empathy you develop for yourself, the more you're able to change. You're not stuck like Tim Ferriss is explaining, like the quote that he's sharing. Jamie Gill goes on to write in the book, the process of grateful grieving is a rebirth. I thought this was an especially helpful paragraph for parents with children that are struggling. The process of grateful grieving is a rebirth. We start out mourning the childhood we never had, feeling sad and angry for our losses. Slowly, we move to grateful grieving, a way station, she calls it. Evolved adults can hold two or more feelings in their hearts simultaneously. They accept that their parents are not all good or all bad, but flawed people doing the best they can, even if it's not good enough. Once we make peace with ambivalence and learn to parent ourselves, we are free to move through the way station of grateful grief and enter the space of pure gratitude, where we are grateful for our parents' good qualities and we understand and accept their limitations, which can serve as a catalysts for our own transformation. The weight of anger, victimization, fear, and even hate begins to lift. So the pathway through it is messy and difficult. But if we give space for the child, and sometimes that just means letting them go to a therapist, right? Or getting them to a therapeutic program if the situation is acute enough. Or talking to a mentor or a rabbi or a priest or somebody else, a mentor. When we allow our parents to talk about it, to feel it, they move through these stages. So the best way to help your child get over it, to move beyond it, to let go of the anger, is for you as a parent to learn how to give them space for their anger. I tell this to parents all the time who ask me, my young adult child doesn't trust me. My young adult child tells me that I'm not safe to talk to. What do I do? And I always say, tell them thank you. Thank you for telling me that. I'm glad you're letting me know. Period. Full stop. The only sensical answer when somebody tells you that they don't trust you is to thank them for it. When someone says to you, I don't feel heard by you, is to thank them. Because if we try to argue against what they're sharing, we're proving the very point that they're accusing us of. And we do it a lot. Jamie writes, if when we were young, the other person didn't know how to love well, when we grow up, we want to find someone who can love well. If the other person was abusive, we want to find someone to be kind. If the other person didn't give us sufficient attention, we want to find someone who's highly attentive. However, the twist in this story is that we are drawn toward people who remind us of the person with whom our dynamic originated. Again, when you're mad at your spouse, like I've been at times, you want to believe the lie that you are much better, much more evolved, much more advanced than your spouse, and that somehow you married down psychologically speaking, right? That's what we all think in our anger, in our hurt. And in a very real sense, that's a delusion. We wouldn't be with them unless we were attracted to them, right? And we were attracted to them in part because it reminded us unconsciously of the only safety we experienced in our childhood. I've shared this story, but it's been a while since, about some mice studies that were done by Dr. Nottingham at Columbia University. And she took these mice and she shocked them. She separated baby mice into two categories, and she shocked all the mice. And she paired the shocking with the fragrance of peppermint. Half of the mice were shocked by themselves in a cage, half of the baby mice. The other half were shocked, same peppermint smell, same electrical current. But the difference is that those mice were nestling and looking and seeking comfort with the parent. So the mice that were alone, and the mice that were together started off essentially in the same place, with the only difference being one was with the mother and one wasn't. Later, when they put these mice into mazes with different tubes going to different scents, different smells, different fragrances, the mice that were shocked by themselves almost always avoided the peppermint. And the mice that were shocked when their mother was present almost always went toward the peppermint. What does that show us in mice? It's this quote. It's this thing I just read to you. What it shows us is that attachment trumps trauma. The attachment style that we experienced as children was the only thing that gave us any comfort. And so if it was chaotic or judgmental or rigid or kind, or it was marked by psychological health and well-being, whatever that was, we're attracted to that. Because that the part of our brain that is seeking out safety makes that connection. This is perhaps the most relevant to the parents that listen to the podcast, but it also can be relevant. Whenever I talk about parenting, this is one of the biggest misunderstandings about people like myself who write a lot about parenting. People assume I'm talking about the task of parenting, that I'm talking to people who have children, and I am. That's part of it. But I'm really talking to anybody who is a parent or anybody who had a parent, which is all of us. So part of the idea of talking about parenting and child development constantly is it's a backdoor way of teaching you about your own childhood and your own wounds. And those lessons and ideas can contribute to healthy relationships between two partners, between people that you work with, between you and your siblings, so forth and so on. At any rate, the chapter on rebellion. Somebody asked about this last night during the question and answer. Jamie writes, the child's defiance, their resentful, angry pushback, is best understood as expressing vengeful disapproval of their parents' disapproval. I love that. A child's defiance is best understood as the expression of vengeful disapproval of parents' disapproval. It's a way of lashing back out, unconsciously trying to get the parent to feel what the child is feeling. That is so often the drive of our pathological behavior, our mean, our unkind behavior, is we want the person that we're directing it towards to feel what we're feeling. Jamie writes, we are used to thinking of rebels in negative terms, yet these are the people who are responsible for most of our advancements, discoveries, art, philosophy, discoveries of all kinds that come from thinking outside of the box. It's rarely in-box thinkers who come up with revolutionary ideas. Such people are routinely busy being obedient and following protocols. New ideas don't live there. They live beyond there. It's like what I believe it's Eleanor Roosevelt is credited, or at least I've seen her credited as saying that well-behaved women don't make history. It's the same idea. You know, one thing I want to say to all of the kids out in our treatment program whenever I meet with them is you're all okay. In fact, sometimes when I say this, I get very tearful because I'm talking to myself. I was one of them. But I like to say to them, you're okay. Of course, you've made some mistakes, done some stupid things, but we all have. Heaven knows I've made more than most, more than you, just by virtue of the amount of years that I've had practicing this life. But beyond all of those mistakes, so many of you are going to be the difference makers in the world. And so many of you will have advantages over children who never struggled, people who never struggled. If you let this work sink into you, you'll have more compassion and empathy for others that struggle. Now, I know framing rebellion as a positive can be really, really challenging, especially because the rebels' underlying attempt is to make you miserable, to make you feel powerless, to make you feel helpless, to make you feel the same frustration, sadness, and anger and fear that they feel. But as we do the work and as it gets inside of us, as it becomes a part of us, we change our relationship to rebellion. We change our relationship to obedience. We change our relationship to concepts like good and bad and right and wrong. As we heal, we see more. We hear more. It's like when my mother-in-law said to me, she's a retired teacher, you know, after reading my first book, I wish you could go out and teach teachers about children because of your experience in working with children. And I said, if I were to teach teachers, which I have since, I wouldn't teach them about children. I would teach them how to listen. And I would teach them what gets in the way of listening, their judgments, their fears, the ideas that they grew up with. And my hope would be that they would learn to listen well enough that the child, each individual child, would tell them about them and they could hear it, tell them what they needed, and the teacher could hear it. Jamie goes on to write, harsh limits. This is a really important couple of paragraphs. Harsh limits may serve to control behavior in the short term, but such an approach does not help a child learn how to self-regulate. In fact, harsh limits can precipitate a resistance on the part of the child to take responsibility. True self-discipline, she explains, this is the key. True self-discipline, on the other hand, develops from the internalization of loving limits. It's not correlated with how strict you are or not. It's if you can dispense limits, if you can exercise boundaries in clear, non-rageful, non-judgmental, non-fear-based ways. True self-discipline, on the other hand, develops from the internalization of loving limits. I remember many years ago, I was walking with a group of teenagers in the wilderness doing my job. And one of the ethics that we have out there is we try to leave everything out in the wilderness better than when we found it. We make it look, you know, we practice leave no trace. And that includes the hikes that we go on, that when we're walking on a hike and we come across garbage or trash, that we pick it up and put it in the group's garbage sack that's being carried on the hike. I remember one day thinking about this principle that I just read to you, and I was in the back because as I'm talking to one of the clients, I'm slower than everybody else, and so are they. And we walked across a bunch of trash along the pathway that I was aware that every person in front of us, which was everybody in our group, had walked right over and past it. So I stopped and I called the entire group. We made a circle around the garbage, and I just said, "Would somebody pick this up, please?" And somebody picked up the trash and put it in the group's bag that we were carrying. And I said, "Thank you." And I said, "Let's keep going." And it's not like I can do that every day. I react. I lash out. I get triggered. And in those instances, it's my responsibility to model accountability and apologize, to take responsibility and accountability for my behavior, my contribution to the problem. Jamie says, when limits are established without empathy, fear becomes a motivating force. Jamie writes, parents who don't display natural empathy for their children routinely have children who display no empathy for their parents, right? We learn about ourselves from our parents, who learned about themselves from their parents, who learned about themselves from their parents on infinitum, right? All the way back. And when we don't have empathy, we don't teach, we don't model empathy. I remember when my son, one of my happiest moments as a father was when my oldest, who's now 29 years old, was around 5 years old. We were watching Disney's Peter Pan. And I remember he paused the video, or maybe he didn't pause. Maybe I paused it when he started talking. But he turned to me at one moment when Captain Hook was doing his thing. And he said to me, looking at me, he said, "Dad, Captain Hook isn't bad. He's just sad, right?" And I thought, yes, that's true. He's not bad. He's just sad and scared. But like we do with some stories, we make the villain obvious, so there's no mistake. Unless the story is a little bit more complex, more suited for adults. This is one of my favorite passages from Jamie's chapter on rebellion. Jamie writes, when parents belittle adolescents for the lives they are trying on and taking off, adolescents are very likely to interpret this as, I need to act a certain way to gain your support and love. You don't like who I am because you are always trying to change me. If I'm not the person you want me to be, you will withhold your love and support. You don't really care how I feel or what I think. You only want me to agree with you. You want me to be respectful when you aren't. This is what it looks like when we're trying to control and shape them, versus, again, thinking about it as supporting them where they need to go. This doesn't lead to laissez-faire parenting. It doesn't mean that you don't have clear limits and boundaries. Doesn't mean you don't, if your child is struggling at the level that the children are struggling at that come to our program. It doesn't mean you don't send them to the program or ground them or do things. It doesn't mean any of those things at all. It just comes from a different place. It comes from, this is what I feel comfortable with. This is the way that we're going to do it. I could be wrong. I could be crazy. You're allowed to be mad. You're allowed to not like it. And you're allowed to disagree with it. And I won't try to talk you into it. That's what it looks like. Such thoughts, Jamie writes, lead to estrangement between adolescents and their parents. It is common for adolescents to feel unheard by their parents. They miss the closeness they once felt to their parents also. Jamie writes, one reason parental limits and boundaries in the face of rebellion are so fraught with difficulties is that the presence of the rebellion itself speaks to a disturbed parent-child relationship. In other words, once the rebellion shows up, something previous to that moment is already broken in the parent-child relationship. In all likelihood, the child has not been heard or allowed to speak his or her true feelings without retaliation. This is another reason a therapist is a good idea. The therapist can interrupt inbred, damaging family patterns and allow for a fair hearing of all views. One of the reasons why I'm glad that my children all seek therapy on their own and like to do it is because I want them to have a place to complain about me with an empathic other and their mother. It's really important that ideally we can listen, but we're limited. We're human. We run out of energy. We're stressed. We're insecure. All of those things prevent the listening. But we work on all of that stuff. We work on boundaries and taking care of ourselves so we can be there for our children. But outside of that, that's why a therapist is a good idea. I want my children to be able to say to another adult, my dad's an idiot. My mom is crazy. And I want someone to say to that child, if it can't be me all the time or my wife all the time, I want somebody to say to that child, tell me more. But if the therapist takes on the parent's self-esteem, they will gaslight the child. They will tell the child that they're blaming, that they're being a victim, that they're making excuses. They'll push for accountability on the child's part. And they'll tell the child how it's no excuse for their behavior and their response. And it's not like those ideas are inaccurate in some sense, but all of those ideas that I just shared get in the way of hearing the child and the child feeling heard. You can have clear boundaries and empathy at the same time. We're just not used to it because we reduce everything to we can only set boundaries in our anger, in our rage, in our hurt. Until we heal, then we learn to set them from a different place. I'll give you a small example of a healthy boundary I set the one time I did it out of the many times that I've struggled, of course, and how I set a clear boundary and also showed empathy. And even how confusing it was to my daughter at the time. My daughter, who's now 14, who at the time was probably 5 or 6. We had at the time a Rottweiler named Coda, and we loved Coda. I loved Coda. He was my best buddy. And one time, Liv said to me, it's really unfair that Coda can't sit on the couch with us. That was one of the rules with Coda, among others. And I said to her empathically, it is unfair, isn't it? It kind of stinks, doesn't it? And here's what she said. She said, oh, so he can sit on the couch? And I said, no. No, it's still the boundary. But I understand it. And the fact that she responded to my empathic resonance with her, kind of joining with her and relating with her, the fact that she heard it as changing of my boundaries tells you something about our family. That many children conflate empathy with no boundaries because parents conflate the two. You know, because we struggle, because we weren't shown it, because it wasn't modeled for it, because we don't see it in the world, that I can say, I love you, I care about you, and the answer is no. And I have compassion for you, but I can't have this in my life. And that's really what you learn when you go to Al-Anon. What I was just saying, you really learn what it means to be a person, a loving, capable, adult, healthy person. And what you learn is that no is a complete sentence, and you can do it from a place of love, not always anger. Anger is a signal that it's gotten out of balance. Anger is a signal that we're not taking care of ourselves. Resentment is a sign that we're not setting good boundaries for ourselves. We can have empathy and judgment, and we can have clear boundaries at many different levels of structure and strictness. Jamie writes, the urge to rebel and to do the opposite of what we are told may involve an effort to regain a sense of control over a situation in which we feel we have lost control. Again, once we understand that, we think and feel and react to rebellion differently, to defiance differently. Again, doesn't mean that we drop our boundaries. It just means we have a different emotional response to it. I love this quote. It's one of my favorite quotes. Some of you will remember it. It was in 2010. It was a commercial that the Apple Corporation used, a poetic letter written by John Chapman. And it goes like this. Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs and the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones that do, the ones who do. Your child is an invitation into a higher level of consciousness, your struggling child. Your child is a signal to the family that something is broken. Something needs to be unlearned. Something needs to be adjusted. Something's broken. And in many, many cases, the children who I see in any form of therapy we do, from our intensive programs to our wilderness therapy program to even the private practice that I've been a part of, the children who struggle are the ones that often make the biggest difference in the world, just like this poem suggests. And so we have to change our ideas about obedience and compliance in terms of respect and how we respond to them. There's a lot of students, a lot of clients that need, especially the ones who turn the anger inward into self-harm or self-medicating or depression, intense anxiety. A lot of times we're trying to inject into them a lot more healthy rebellion. Jamie talks about healthy rebellion in this chapter. I didn't include that in tonight's presentation, but she talks about healthy rebellion and healthy leadership. Excuse me, healthy rebel leadership. But a lot of times we take somebody who's struggling with an eating disorder or self-harm, and we want them to direct the anger outward. I remember I had a case one time where I took a child who felt very wounded and very not heard by his parents, who was there because of suicidal ideation, and I fanned the flames of his anger towards his parents. I was trying to redirect the anger away from it going inside of him to suicide and outside to the world. And so in the following week, he wrote a really angry letter to his parents, like many of them do. And then the parents were concerned and upset with me and thinking we sent our child to help them, not to make it worse. And we read the letter together. And the first thing the young man said to his parents is, I don't feel suicidal anymore, but I'm not sure I want you in my life. And I said, this was after the second week, I said, it's a process. Like Jamie was talking about earlier, that kind of process that we go through, that grief process that we go through. And while we're not gonna hang our hat on this and assume that this is absolutely solidified inside of your son, what I want to note is that he said, first off, I don't feel suicidal anymore. I feel angry at you. And I know that this is reductionistic in itself after I've been speaking against that, but in a very simple way, that's a lot of what psychotherapy is in these treatment programs. It doesn't matter if it's an adult program in Arizona or Florida, right? Or New Jersey for adult addicts. A critical part of the therapy is going to be when the addict or the mentally ill person, the person struggling with mental illness, is able to say to their spouse, to their parents, if they're willing to hear it, to their siblings, this is where I was hurt. This is where I was angry. And if a therapist is present facilitating, the therapist will ask all those folks to just shut up and listen. Not to take blame or responsibility for the addicts or the person who's struggling with addiction or the person struggling with mental health, not to take responsibility for their choices, but to give them a safe place to express their feelings so they don't have to be expressed symptomatically. Because that's essentially what symptoms are. They're the expression of the unexpressed needs, the unexpressed feelings. And I'll tell you, I can listen a lot easier to your children tell me what crazy mixed up parents they have than I can to my own children. So that's another reason to get help. to get somebody from outside the family. So that's Jamie's book in part 2. There's a lot of things. I skipped a couple of chapters that talk about more societal, sociological issues. She talks about American religion, and a couple of other things that I don't spend a lot of time on because that's not the purview of what I'm talking about, what I'm teaching about. But I find it interesting nonetheless. But Jamie is somebody who has done the work and is coming back to share the message from the oracle, if you will. She's put in the work, not just academically, being in my experience the smartest therapist that I've ever met. But what makes Jamie a rebel in the good way is she's looked at herself. She's been in therapy for decades. And in a sense, if you decide to follow the road less traveled and kind of go along with the idea that we talk about in these podcasts and broadcasts about doing your own work, you're going to be a rebel. You're going to be going against the norm, outside of the box. All right, folks. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible. Our charitable partners are Choose Mental Health. Go to choosementalhealth.org, or Sky's the Limit Fund. Go to sky'sthelimitfund.org, or the Evoke Family Foundation, evokefamilyfoundation.org. If you want help or resources, or you want to give back, those are 3 great places to go. We have support groups for current and alumni wilderness families. The next one is March 31st, tomorrow evening at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Once a month, we have an alumni-only meeting. That'll be April 26th at 6:30 p.m. And then we have an intensive support group every month online. April 12th, 6 p.m. is the next one. Contact intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information or to register. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, and that's what I'm talking about, that's how I learned what I know, is by doing the work, by going to intensives myself many, many times over. Our next available offering is April 20th through 24th. We also have an online offering. The next one of those is June 24th through 26th. For more information or to register, contact intensives@evoketherapy.com. We also have a returning to you. If you've been to Finding You and you want to come back and reconnect to your work, Returning to You will be May 11th through 15th. It is going to be hosted and facilitated by my wonderful, talented daughter, Emma Reedy, and the incomparable Alex White. A fantastic team. That will sell out, so reach out soon if you're interested. We have coaches at Evoke. They can do parent coaching, family coaching, couple coaching, individual coaching. They're trained in the attachment-based model that we use here at Evoke. Just contact coaching@evoketherapy.com. And we also have pursuit trips for adults and families, 3 to 30 days, adventure trips customized anywhere around the world. Think therapy light or reconnecting to your work, but also having a lot of fun. We ask all current families to go to all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups, any combination of alanon.org, coda.org, familiesanonymous.org, or adultchildren.org. You can also go to refugerecovery.org to find a Buddhist-inspired recovery program. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, you can go to NAMI.org to find free resources and classes in your area. All of these broadcasts that I do are available also on the podcast app. Just search Spotify or your favorite podcast app using the name Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast, or go to soundcloud.com. You can find Evoke or me, Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles @EvokeTherapy or @Dr. Brad Reedy. You can also find intensives on Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, our blog has wonderful content each week curated by Malia, who also moderates for me this evening. So thank you, Malia. I'm on vacation next week, so my next broadcast will be April 12th at 6:30 p.m. I'll be doing a Q&A. Any questions left over from this evening or any topics you want to ask about, you can always email us at webinar@evoketherapy.com to send in questions or requests for topics in between, or give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you. For and on behalf of the people that love you, thank you for being willing to do your work. I hope this was a helpful point of contact. Have a great evening, and I'll see you after my vacation. Take care. Bye-bye.